Welcome everyone to another episode of To The Point with Greg and Grant. This is the podcast that gets to the point, stays on point, and makes a point. As you all know, we are the podcast that is focused on the aerospace and defense industry. And we are back with the third and final installment of our interview with Ellis Freedman from Serious Science. Greg, would you like to say hi?
I would. Hello everyone, welcome back. As you recall, in our first segment, we talked about Ellis's 30-plus years experience in the aerospace and defense industry, along with various applications of remote sensing. And then in our second segment, we focused more on career and industry challenges.
And today, we will be getting into his advice for new folks entering into the industry, perceived threats to national security, and more. All right, enough of that. Let's get to the point. Ellis Freedman, Part 3. Now. Well, changing gears just slightly, one of the topics we like to talk about on this podcast is advice for folks just coming out of school and preparing to go into the industry for the first time. What tops your list with regards to advice for someone just starting in the field?
Broaden your knowledge as much as possible. That's easier today than it used to be. It's easy enough to go on YouTube, take courses. You don't have to take them for credit. Mm-hmm. People don't come along and say, oh, what course did you take in such and such? If you know this subject, that's fine. Just as I took the A course, I would recommend that other people try to broaden their engineering capabilities. Don't pigeonhole yourself. I actually have a cousin who really specialized. I hope he doesn't hear this, but he wanted to specialize in building roller coasters. And yes, he's got a job in building roller coasters. I'm not sure he's going to have a whole lot of opportunity with a lot of companies, but I'm glad he's pursuing his dream. But if he was broader, I think his opportunities would widen.
Yeah, this actually goes back to something that both Greg and I have heard from others before, that it almost seems to be kind of turned the tide where it's becoming more important to be a generalist in skills as opposed to a specialist.
Yes, it can be. Well, this goes back to what I said about the SI. Part of my job was to know a fair amount about a lot of different things, whether it was sensors, orbital mechanics, communications for ground stations, ground processing. I had to know everything. Now, could I go out and build a ground station? Well, actually, I probably could, but not a satellite. Yeah. And I'm not a hardware person, but at least I understood all the problems in hardware. And we need people like that. And one of my pet peeves, and don't take this personally, we've seen a big shift in the last 20 or 30 years from general engineering to software engineering. Now, look, software engineering is really important and it's a big field and that's great. But someone once pointed out to me that one of the reasons people do that is it's much easier to get a sense of immediate gratification in software. You can write a piece of software and in anywhere from a minute to a few days, you can see the actual results of what you've done. It's not so easy in all other forms of engineering. So whether you want to build an airplane or a radar system or a rocket or a train or anything like that, even a ballpoint pen, as I tell kids in that high school class that I teach, some engineer had to be able to build that. We've got so many people going into software, and we have so few going into, I hate to call it hardcore engineering, but traditional engineering, that it's been a real problem. And we need people who know all these aspects of engineering. Now, having said that, if you're in traditional engineering, you'd better know programming. And you'd better know algorithm development. And depending upon your engineering, you better know everything all the way on down to this is what a register is and this is how you work in assembly language and so on. But you really have to be able to handle multiple fields of discipline nowadays. And that's one of the ways you get ahead because, first of all, it makes you more valuable. Obviously, you need something that you're really an expert in, but you should have value across multiple fields. But it also makes it easier for you to innovate, to see other things that can be done in other fields. Mm-hmm. That's how you get people in mechanical engineering going into bioengineering for things like artificial hearts. That's why you get chemical engineering finding ways to build things in bioengineering like artificial kidneys or an artificial pancreas. It's that innovation that really helps. But you can't do that unless you understand at least the basics of, oh, this is the problem with building such and such. You don't have to be able to build it, but at least you should recognize what's going on in the different fields.
Sure. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense.
It does.
I mean, it really goes back to what we were talking about before with, the competition becoming more stiff, as companies merge together and everything as well. You have that wider knowledge base. It gives you a much easier time to compete.
Right. Now, having said that, the flip side of this is, in the United States, we're not graduating nearly as many engineers as we need. So in that sense, you become more valuable no matter who you are.
Sure.
Unless, of course, you're directly competing with, say, a Chinese engineer who wants to come over on a visa or whatever. So the market's getting better, but it's getting better in different ways. And there are different parts of engineering that are really, I think, are really becoming hot at this point. And again, you don't have to be a specialist in these things, but you have to understand and recognize them. Even if you say, I want to go into defense. My big push lately has been in material science and nanotechnology. And
are they the parts of the engineering you just mentioned that you think are becoming hot?
I think those are going to be the hot fields for many years to come. We're making breakthroughs just about every day. Right? Look at a cell phone. 20 years ago, my goodness, we didn't have things like this. Yeah. Now we have microgyros. We have accelerometers that you can buy by the 1,000 gross at pennies a piece that get stuck in these things. You have all these nanotechnology techniques. The infrared sensor that I attach to my phone is what's called a microbolometer, and that's basically nanotech. Of course, nanotech gets into things like microelectronics. When you're building transistors, they're now getting down to, I believe, how small? I mean, it's 8 nanometer, I believe, or 6 nanometer now for transistors over at Intel. Or I was just looking at a focal plane that they're down to 0.8 microns for the detector. Really, I didn't know you could do that. I mean, you're getting down to the lower than the wavelength of some light. All of this is nanotech and material science. Material science, I'm sure you've heard about things like cloaking technology, a la Star Trek. Again, material science. There's so many things coming down the pike.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable. And I think those are the big pushes. Because we're going into some miniaturization and things that work on the chemical level for materials as opposed to large-scale levels. Which is not to say that we don't need other engineers. We still need people to build airplanes and railroad trains and things like that. Bridges, architectural engineering, and we still need a lot of those. But I think the really hot, innovative stuff is materials and nanotech.
So for the listening audience that may be in school right now or shortly just got out of school and have their first job for the first year or two, what would you recommend to them? For getting into for within the aerospace industry to continue to hone in on their skills, what would you say to them in terms of broadening their skills? Where would you suggest or recommend they on their job increase their skill sets while on the current job that they have?
Well, it depends on the company they work for. Some companies will allow you to rotate between assignments, like every 6 months. And I definitely recommend that. Yeah. Sometimes it takes a little more effort on your part. If you're in a big company, I would start looking at job openings in other parts of your company that may be of more interest to you, or in areas that you want to expand into. Again, I would look at YouTube. I know it sounds crazy, and it takes a lot of discipline. Believe me, I understand. It's hard to sit down and just take a course on YouTube. Nobody wants to sit there and, I mean, I've sat through courses, but you can't just watch a YouTube video and pick everything up by osmosis. You have to actually sit there and say, okay, now I'm going to do an exercise in it with a homework assignment. That's when people kind of fall back. But it's really worth doing.
Yeah, how about the online programs that you see too? You recommend those?
Yeah, any one of these sources. I'm trying to remember what's the one. I wish I remembered the one somebody had recommended, but he was more interested in saying, "Oh, you can get credit for that," and I didn't care at the time about getting credit. Even Khan Academy is great. I actually started watching one of their videos the other day on chemistry, and it was great. I mean, he was filling in blanks that I'd forgotten. It was wonderful.
I push my kids to do that as well. Just added information to help.
Right. Even if you don't do the exercises, maybe it will make something click and you'll go, yeah, now I got it. I understand what they're talking about. So.
All right, well, one thing that I wanted to ask you about as well, which I mentioned at the very beginning of the show, was you have a number of publications out there, and I was just kind of curious if there was one that was especially near and dear to your heart, and why.
Wow, that's a tough one.
They're all your favorites, right?
Yeah.
No. My publications, I'd almost have to look at them to see.
It's like I saw one about like Landsat 7, I believe, and
yeah, my early stuff was Landsat 7. There were a couple of papers on that. I don't think I have a favorite. Perhaps that's because very little was done with them after the fact. Unfortunately, it turns out that the vast majority of technical papers out there are really not worth publishing. As an example, I believe it was my paper on Landsat calibration, and I submitted that to the conference, and they came back and they said, it's too long, you should make this into 3 or 4 papers. And I said, why? I'm not waiting to do any more work. All the answers are here.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't I just publish the whole thing?
Mm-hmm.
Well, they're coming from a viewpoint of publish or perish. The more papers you publish, the more prestigious it is. And my point was, I don't want to publish. Writing a paper is tough. I had already written a paper. Here are all the answers. Send it out there. And a lot of people will, dare I say, milk a subject for many, many, many papers. You'll find the same or similar papers at, say, 6 different conferences. It's very hard to narrow things down. One of my concerns about which is my favorite, I don't think I have a favorite. The problem is, as I said, I don't think anyone has ever used what I published. Which is not to say that it wasn't worthwhile. It's just, I guess it gets lost in the ether of all the papers that are out there. I thought I was doing a pretty good job on one of those Landsat papers. Landsat 5 was experiencing something called striping. You'd see these, well, basically stripes in the image. It wasn't obscuring the image. It was like an overlay of, like Venetian blinds on the image. And we had discovered by evaluating the raw data that they were calibrating it incorrectly. Or I should say, they were a little bit off in their measurements when they were calibrated to get rid of this. And I contacted the chief scientist about it when we wrote this up. And unfortunately, his response was, we get paid to produce imagery. We don't get paid to produce good imagery. And I came across that many times in my career. So no, I don't think I really have a favorite. If something had actually been used,
right?
Then I would have said, well, I really made an impact on it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So here's a question for you regarding just national security in general. Given your knowledge, what do you think is one of the biggest threats to national security today? And you can come up with one other than, say, is it the space race? Is it protecting our space assets from threats? Is it cyber attacks? Is it hypersonic vehicles? All the above? What would you think if you had to choose one, Ellis?
Well, it's kind of an open-ended.
It is.
Yeah, it is. Absolutely.
We have severe threats in terms of espionage from both the Chinese and the Russians. Since I had what we call tickets, it was drummed into our heads about security, and so I'm a little more aware than most people about this.
Mm-hmm.
When I see something in the news about the Chinese or the Russians doing something, I go, "Oh yeah, they told us about this 30 years ago. We knew about this." They're just either becoming more blatant about it, or or it's just making the news more. But it's been known for a long time, but it's getting much more severe now. So that's a really big threat. And in fact, just in the news lately, you saw that charges were brought against Huawei, the Chinese phone company. And if you read what they were doing, it was absolutely blatant. They were just telling engineers to go in and steal the concepts from T-Mobile. They wanted pictures, they wanted diagrams. People were accommodating. And that's just phones. You can only imagine what's going on in other areas. Other threats. Well, let's stay away from nuclear threats. I think we all know about that.
Mm-hmm.
It's a tough one. We have so many security threats out there. As engineering progresses, we end up in situations where we may still be at the bleeding edge with some of our technology, but the bleeding edge is always moving. And as the bleeding edge moves forward, the previous bleeding edge becomes commonplace. And the commonplace is becoming very dangerous. So you're getting to the point where places like North Korea or Iran can now build missiles, fairly large missiles. I'm not especially worried right now, but in a few years I would be. And that's because all this engineering becomes commonplace. It goes from being bleeding edge classified to just bleeding edge commercial to being published in papers worldwide to anybody can look it up on the web.
Yeah.
And that's what's happening. And it's happening in a lot of different ways.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure. Like I said, it's such an open-ended
Mm-hmm.
question.
That's great.
Okay.
I appreciate that.
Now, Ellis, we have talked quite a bit about the industry, aerospace and defense. We've talked about the fields of engineering, remote sensing. I was a little curious to learn a little bit more about the company that you are currently running, Serious Science. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it's a one-man company. I'm basically consulting. I've had contracts with Lockheed Martin in pursuing future Landsats and other satellites out there. There have been a couple of things on the side that I've been doing. A colleague and I have been working quite a few years now on an interpolator. And for those of you who aren't familiar, you may remember in school when you wanted to interpolate between 2 points you would do what's called a linear interpolation. You draw a line, you'd say, okay, I want to go over this far on the line, and I'll find the point on that line. That's interpolation. Well, interpolation can be much more complicated than that. But the biggest problem with interpolation is it blurs an image. It actually blurs any signal, but it will blur, since I was working with imagery, it will blur an image. More than that, the amount of blur varies depending upon the distance that you interpolate. So for example, if you wanted to zoom in on an image, then a pixel in the middle wouldn't have any interpolation because it's right where it's supposed to be. The pixel next to it might be interpolated, let's say, 1/100th of a pixel because you're expanding a little bit. But the ones on the edge might be interpolated, say, 7/8 of a pixel. So what that means is that every pixel is going to have a different level of blur induced on it based upon the interpolation process itself. Now, when you normally say to people, oh, well, I've got a blurry image, I'll sharpen it with a little sharpening kernel in your software. The problem is you can't, because if you pick a sharpener in software for the image, you may be sharpening the correct amount on this pixel, but all the other pixels will be incorrect. They'll be over-sharpened or under-sharpened. So you can never back out the blurring of an interpolator. We have an interpolator that doesn't blur. Or I should say, at least it's a constant blur. But theoretically, you can compensate for the blur and make sure that the image that's been interpolated doesn't experience any blur. Now, this really becomes an issue in some cases. It's one thing to say, oh, I'm just going to shift an image a little bit. That's an easy one. But in imagery today, you do a lot of processing in terms of warping imagery, especially in mapping. You know, when you take a satellite image, for example, and you want to map it to the ground, there are, 30 different kinds of maps. There's transverse Mercator, there are polar coordinates. Every one of those will have a different amount of blur in every different pixel based upon how you warp it, because warping requires that you interpolate. Mm-hmm. Theoretically, our interpolator would not do that. And one of my papers that you mentioned is on the website about that. And I also wanted to apply that to medical imagery. So there you go, back again to what I was talking about with trying to know something about other fields.
Other disciplines, yeah.
Right. And the other thing I'm working on, I think I mentioned, is pushing for this mid-wave infrared imagery from space. And I would have presented that to NASA, but unfortunately, the day after I made an appointment with NASA, they shut the government down. So I'm waiting to hear about that.
Right. Well, so on your website, you have your contact information if folks wanted to reach out to you about these topics. Do you mind if we give that out?
No, go right ahead.
Okay. So Ellis's website is www.serioussciencellc.com. And if you guys would like to reach out to him, the email to use would be info@serioussciencellc.com. So now, Ellis, as we start to wrap up here, our catchphrase on this podcast is that we get to the point, stay on point, and make a point. What point would you like to start ending this podcast making? What point would you like to make? Overall, out of everything that we covered, what would you like people to walk away knowing?
It would be advice for engineers, and that is pursue on your own time your dreams, your creativity, your innovation. A job can just be a job, but engineering very often is a calling. And if you want to really make a difference, as many engineers do, you're going to have to follow up on what you like as opposed to necessarily what your boss likes.
That's an excellent point.
That's a great point, and certainly a great one to end on.
Well, Ellis, thank you very much for joining us. We greatly appreciate
You're very welcome.
Yes,
your
thank
time,
you very much.
all the advice, insight. It's been a great time.
Thank you. How often do I get a chance to shoot the breeze like that?
I hope you guys enjoyed this segment and the previous 2 segments we spent with Mr. Ellis Freedman. It was definitely a blast talking with him about his experience and getting his take on the industry. If you missed the previous segments, you can always find them on our YouTube page called Greg and Grant. And while you're there, please feel free to subscribe to us so you don't miss future episodes. I appreciate you guys joining us, and we'll be seeing you again soon when we get to the point with another intriguing guest. Thanks for listening.
The views expressed in this podcast are our own and not those of the companies we work for currently or previously, or of any person or organization affiliated or doing business with those companies.